If you grew up in the 90s, there are certain things that have just been kind of indelibly burned into your hippocampus, like the flag of the USSR descending for the last time, Fruitopia, Denise Richards, and some guy yelling, "This is the remix," followed by this existentially vexing air horn. Well, my fellow gun hipsters, this is the remix of all your favorite 90s Wondernines. And this one's got a funky K-pop vibe that'll have you jamming to a whole new DASA groove. And that's what we're going to talk about today here on Hipster Tactical.
This is the remix.
Alright guys, the Daewoo DP51, and if you don't know, the DP51s are basically commercial versions of the South Korean K5 service pistols. And this is the DP51 compact. There's of course a full size, but I'm going to speak generally about the Daewoo DP51 platform, which will also include the guns that are currently sold by Lionheart Industries. So the LH9 series, the Regulus series, and the current Vulcan series. So all those guns are based on the DP51, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about will apply to those guns. Just thinking about what this gun is and thinking about kind of the theme for this review, looking at it, you can, if you're familiar with kind of the so-called Wondernines, the high-capacity double-action, single-action combat pistols that were very prevalent in the late 80s and 90s, you can see elements of those guns kind of in this gun. And that kind of inspired the corny remix theme for this video. This gun came out in the very tail end of the 80s, kind of the early 90s, basically. So, you know, all that drama and intrigue in the U.S. military's XM9 trials, that had already happened, and the South Korean designers obviously were privy to that. You know, just thinking about, of late, thinking about Korean stuff, Korean culture, Korean pop culture, Korean food, Korean cars, it's almost like they have this ability to take things, trends, ideas, you know, that are kind of passé in Western culture, and then they kind of reinvent them in their own interesting, unique way, and in some ways make them better. If you think about PSY, the Gangnam Style guy, like, you know, it's pop music. Like, it's not like we haven't seen that before, but it's just a little bit odd, a little bit different, and just unique and kind of fun, and people loved it all over the world. Bringing us back to the subject at hand, this pistol, the DP51, I think in many ways it takes the Wondernine paradigm and just puts that twist of Korean quirk into it that just makes it kind of unique and endearing and in some ways better, I think, and smarter than, you know, the kind of standard template for the classic Wondernines. And as we'll get into, this gun has some really innovative features which I think make it very worth talking about and very interesting. But at the same time, it's very much, it has that classic feel, and it has that classic feel of a classic 90s Wondernine. It just feels solid, it feels dense, it feels very well made, it feels high quality, it feels like a professional grade piece of machinery. So, since I am saying that this is basically a remix of lots of different guns from the late 80s, early 90s, I want to talk about that. The first thing you notice, if you're familiar with guns from that era, looking at the Daewoo pistol, is its similarity to the Smith & Wesson 3rd generation pistols. This is my Smith & Wesson 6904. It's the same gun as the Smith & Wesson 6906, and you can see the similarities in terms of the form factor and just the overall layout of the pistol. And looking at the parts, you see definite similarities. They have that same kind of belled barrel design with the pressed in bushing, the press fit bushing. The slides are similarly thin. You know, they use the old school like concentric locking lugs, though the Daewoo uses 2, the Smith & Wesson uses 1, but very, very similar layout. Smith & Wesson 3rd generation magazines, 59 and 69 series magazines, will work interchangeably with the Daewoo pistols. So here's the mag in my 6904, and as you can see, it fits perfectly in the Daewoo, and it runs perfectly. And I've run it with these mags. They run just fine. But again, this is a remix. This is the remix. It's not just the Smith & Wesson cover performance. I think the next really interesting thing that you see in another classic service pistol from the 80s and 90s is the fire control system, especially like the trigger bar and the sear and the trigger itself. It's so similar to the Beretta 92, and I'll cock it here. And these guns are clear, obviously, but you can see they have the trigger bar that runs on the outside of the frame there, and it works almost exactly the same way. And if you look inside to like the linkages and how the trigger bar interfaces with the sear and the double action hammer and the disconnector and everything like that, it's almost identical to the Beretta 92 on the Daewoo. Now, going back to the Smith & Wesson design, if you know something about the Smith & Wesson 3rd gen pistols, you know that the barrel camming mechanism is a little different and unique on the Smith & Wesson 3rd gens. They use like 2 angled lugs kind of on the side of the feed ramp that are responsible for camming the barrel down. And even though as similar as these guns are in terms of their footprint and just overall frame layout and everything, Daewoo did not use that approach. They went to more of a more traditional like center cam path, like an open slot cam path like you'd see on a SIG. So again, just a lot of familiar elements from, you know, the leading service pistols of the late 80s and early 90s are, I think, visible and recognizable in this gun. The difference is this thing's very unique trigger system, which you saw me kind of mess with in the intro, and we'll talk a little bit about that now. So again, in the spirit of that kind of Korean K-pop quirkiness that we all know and love, I think this kind of fits that, and I've never experienced anything like this on a pistol. It's the only pistol platform that offers this kind of a mechanism. Basically, what you've got here is a hinged hammer, and you can see it's fully cocked now, and I can just flick it forward, and you can see the trigger goes forward. The trigger and the hammer go forward into the double action position, but the hammer remains cocked. Even though the head of the hammer goes forward, the shank of the hammer is still rotated back and kind of impinged by the sear. The hammer spring itself is fully compressed, so the gun's fully cocked. It's basically in single action mode, but the hammer and the trigger are just allowed to kind of flip forward. So what that kind of does, it gives you a double action length of pull with a single action brake, essentially. That's probably the best way to describe it. So, and it works as kind of you'd imagine it to work. So, you know, I've cocked the hammer. Well, I'll decock it fully. So I'll cock the hammer. It's cocked. Now I'll flip it forward into double action plus mode. It's sometimes called double action plus, sometimes it's called triple action, sometimes it's called fast action, but it's all the same thing. And so when you shoot it in this mode, yes, the trigger is in the double action position, but when you start to bring it back, it just snicks straight back to the single action position, and then it's just like a normal single action brake from there on. It kind of requires its own technique, at least in my experience. It's not quite like shooting a true double action, it's not quite like shooting a true single action, but it works well, I find. And once I got used to it, I got good results and good groups with it, and in many cases better groups than I would get decocking a traditional double action, single action pistol between shots. So more on that in a sec. So all things considered, I think the Daewoo design is just a very smart design, and not just the trigger system, which I think is good, but just the overall design in general and the elements that they kind of curated from other designs into something that is really its own thing and really, I think, stands apart from a lot of its contemporaries. So when you get this thing in your hands, you get that kind of beefy, broad feel that is so typical of like an 80s, 90s double stack service pistol. The thing that's different about it is, while you get that kind of lateral support from the wider grip dimensions, the depth of the grip is so shallow, and it just allows you to get so much hand around the gun. And I'll also say the trigger reach, especially on the compact, and the compact version compared to the full-size DP51 has a straight backstrap. Compared to any other double stack service pistol from this era, the trigger reach is just so short, and it is just an ergonomic Eden for a person with small hands. And I've got small hands, short fingers, and I mean, look how much finger I can get completely around that trigger. And I don't necessarily pull the trigger all, you know, that far up on my finger, but just the fact that you can, you're very much in control of the pistol, and I feel as though I can really envelop the entire grip on all sides and just completely control the pistol. For a double stack pistol, it's unique in that regard. You know, as you take aim, if you're familiar with the Smith & Wesson 3rd generation pistols, you definitely get kind of a sense of that. It evokes that that kind of presence in your hand. But again, the trigger itself is very Beretta 92, and the brake, to me, feels exactly like almost exactly like the single action brake on a Beretta 92. That very crisp, solid smack. I really enjoy shooting this pistol, and I shoot it very well. I mean, you've seen some of the groups, but I get the sense I experience with this pistol what guys with huge hands experience when they shoot a Glock 19. I'm just in complete control, and with these G10 grips, which are from Lionheart Industries, which I'll talk about here in a moment, you really get good traction. And while the pistol does, the compact does offer a bit of recoil, I think it honestly is a bit more snappy than the 6900 series Smith & Wessons. The fact that you can control it so well and just completely immobilize the gun, even if you've got small hands, like, it doesn't matter. I mean, this gun does what I want it to do. When I go to the range, it's just confidence inspiring, because all I've got to do is just squeeze this thing and pull the trigger, and it's going to put a freaking group where I want it. And that's what I love about this pistol. And I experience excellent accuracy from it. I have heard that some of the early iterations of the K5 DP51 had some issues with rifling, like the rifling was improperly done and they had some accuracy issues. I've never experienced anything to suggest this gun's inaccurate. I find it groups very well at intermediate distances, and most other people who own these guns and the Lionheart guns, I've never heard them complain about accuracy. So I tend to think that was just kind of an issue with the very early ones. It's kind of like one of those things with the Beretta 92's slides breaking and hitting people in the face. It just never goes away. So I want to talk a little bit about shooting the DA Plus system, because again, I think it's kind of requires its own technique, and for me anyway. And initially I was thinking, okay, it's basically a single action trigger, so I'll just take aim, kind of snick it back to the single action position, and then kind of start over like a single action pull. That has never really worked very well for me. You just end up rushing it and you kick your shot off to the side, and I never got good results that way. What I have found works well is you kind of approach it like it's an actual double action. And so again, we're cocked. Flick it into double action plus mode, and you start your trigger pull, and easy, smooth, even pressure, and it snicks back, but you don't just let it shoot. You kind of measure your pressure against the wall then, as if it's kind of one constant pull from the beginning, and then the trigger kind of falls seamlessly and cleanly. And I get good results that way. In many ways, I feel taking that approach, if I'm practicing the double action plus, just kind of doing that between shots, I get tighter groups doing that than I do with most decocking between shots with a traditional double action. In that sense, I think it's a really good system. It's a really smart system, and it delivers on its intent to kind of mitigate that first double action pull. Now, you'll notice there's a manual safety on this gun as well, and if I'm carrying this gun, I carry it in double action plus mode, and I use the safety. And you may wonder, like, what's the point of the double action plus mode if you're going to use the manual safety? You just carry it cocked and locked. And I think that's kind of the point I'm getting at. If you look at the double action plus as kind of a smarter way to carry cocked and locked, I think it makes a lot of sense. And again, the gun's fully cocked. And just to give you a sense of how light this trigger is, like, that's my pinky. And it just, to me, the double action plus is not a replacement for a true double action mechanism. So with the hammer forward and double action plus and the safety on, if the safety does get bumped off, you've got a little more peace of mind that with the hammer forward that there's still something extra between you and a hole where you don't want it. And I think having that hammer forward after you flick your safety off, it just makes that first shot a little more intentional and gives you a layer of what I'll call detente between you and your first shot. If you read some experts' perspectives on double action triggers, they say that can be a good thing, in a what they call a street trigger. And again, just giving you that extra layer of intentionality before you take your first shot can reduce potentially the likelihood of an unintentional discharge. And we already touched on some of the historical context of this gun as far as when it came out and what clearly influenced it in terms of its design. But I think going back to, the background of the South Korean arms industry and how this gun came out of it is kind of interesting. After the Korean War, the South Korean forces obviously had this very tenuous geopolitical situation, they still do today, with communist North Korea. Weapons were important. They needed a sense of security. They needed to have availability of weapons and quality of weapons. So weapons have always been kind of a important thing, I think, for South Korea's national security. Initially, they relied on just a hodgepodge of leftover weapons from the Korean War. But in the early 70s, Colt actually set up a factory near Seoul, and it became known as the Busan Arsenal. And I think I've sometimes seen it called the Busan B versus P. I'm not sure what the correct way is. I don't speak any Korean. They started making M16s under license at this factory near Seoul, and they also made some 1911s. And the thing was, Colt put limits on how many guns they could produce at this Busan arsenal. So Korea wanted to make as many guns as they wanted, and they also wanted to export some of them too, which they ended up doing. So in that same time period, the South Korean government invested heavily and subsidized a lot of industrial interests, including the Daewoo group. Daewoo ended up actually buying the Busan arsenal from Colt in the early 80s. They started designing a new pistol in the mid-80s, kind of right as the U.S. military's XM9 trials were wrapping up. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it's kind of clear that they were looking to that, and looking at what was going on there and kind of using the best ideas and the ideas that were most relevant to what they were looking for in a service pistol. By 1989, this thing was ready to rock and roll, and the ROK forces adopted this pistol as the K5. But in the 90s, they started importing the K5 pistols to the United States under the Daewoo name. And instead of K5, they called it the DP51. And they created the compact variant, as we see here. They also had a DH40 variant, basically a full-size variant, 40 cal, that was imported in the 90s. And a couple different companies imported the Daewoo pistols in the 90s. This one's actually imported by Kimber, and the same Kimber that we know today that makes 1911s, though this is when Kimber was on the West Coast in Oregon, so that's kind of interesting. But there's a big 96 on the inside of this gun, so I think that's when this gun was made or when it was imported. I don't know if Republic of Korea forces actually use the compact in any capacity. I'm not sure. Certainly they use the full size. Maybe detectives, because I think the police and the military used the K5 pistols. Maybe detectives carried this. Maybe people who had very small hands. And then by the end of the 90s, there was a big financial crisis in Asia, and Daewoo fell victim to that. It kind of broke apart, and they spun off the various different industries that Daewoo had their hand in into separate companies. And the company that made defense products, Daewoo Precision Industries, which, basically were made in that old Colt factory, they became S&T Motive. And I guess they continued to make the K5 pistols. And then in 2011, 2012, they got another importer, and they started importing them into the United States again, but under a completely different brand name, Lionheart. So around 2012, these Lionheart pistols show up, completely new company, and I noticed it. I was like, oh, those are cool. They look kind of like classic all-metal pistols like I like. And then you dig a little further, and you find out they're basically, well, they are DP51 pistols, that, the same ones that were imported in the 90s, that are kind of renamed and rebranded. Lionheart didn't exactly shout the fact that they were selling Korean pistols, but they didn't hide it either. And I think anyone who's kind of venturing off the beaten path enough to find a new company like Lionheart Industries is gonna know, what these pistols are, and they're gonna know that the K5 pistols were good pistols. They sold imported Korean pistols until I think around 2019, 2020. Then they started manufacturing the pistols, Daewoo pattern pistols, domestically. And they called the domestically produced ones the Regulus guns, and they stopped importing them from Korea. And the Regulus guns were really expensive. The imported Korean ones, the Lionheart branded imported Korean ones, they were like $700, but the Regulus ones were like $1,500, $1,400-$1,500. They had premium features like titanium nitride barrels with single point machining, really nice sights, really nice finishes. I think the triggers were maybe cleaned up and tuned a little bit, but I'm just not sure how many people were willing to pay that much for one of those pistols. Around, I want to say it was like 2021, Lionheart in Washington packed up and moved to Georgia. And I think there may have been a change in ownership. I'm not 100% sure, but after about a year, they started business again. They started manufacturing pistols again in Georgia, and they sold a slightly different version of the Regulus. It was a little simpler and had slightly different grips and stuff like that. And they sold those for about a year, the Regulus in Georgia. And then in 2023, they introduced a new line of Daewoo-derived pistols called the Vulcan. And those are even more pimped out than the Regulus versions, and they're even more expensive. So we're talking $1,500-$1,600, depending on what feature set you get on your Vulcan pistol. And for me, that's just, I'm not going to pay that. And I'm thinking maybe they're kind of paving the way with their flagship model, and then maybe they'll offer like a more basic version to us working class gun hipsters. So we'll see, but I think they're good guns, and I applaud Lionheart for keeping the dream alive when it comes to the the Daewoo pattern pistols, because I think they're good pistols, and clearly other people do too. I'll also say that, you know, if you do have a legacy Daewoo pistol like this one, you can still buy all the parts you need from Lionheart. And just as a for instance, I have bought these lovely G10 grips from Lionheart. And this is an older version of I don't think their current G10 grips look exactly like this, but you can still get grips, you can still get parts like extractors, magazines, springs, anything you need. Even if you have one of these old pistols, you can still get from Lionheart. And I bought a brand new magazine from Lionheart, works great. Bought a brand new recoil spring from Lionheart, works great. Again, these grips. So that's really cool that while this, in a sense, seems like an old, out-of-production gun, and that's always kind of a stigma about getting an older gun, but really it's not. These guns are still in production, and you can still get parts for them, which is really cool. And I'll say this gun has been... I've had it a number of years. I think I got this gun in 2018. I've put somewhere around 1,000 rounds through it just in the years I've had it. I don't shoot it a ton, but I've never had an issue with it. It runs everything I've put through it, and that's no surprise. I mean, these guns are military-grade pistols, and that's the cool thing about them. You are getting something that is made to military standards, and you know, all the parts are good quality. Everything's forged steel or aluminum for the frame. That is just kind of the reputation that these pistols have. They're good, solid, reliable, military-grade pistols, and that's what you're getting when you buy one of these. As far as carry, these guns are really a good option, I think, because, you know, you've got that double action plus system, which I think is a nice system for carry, but you've got this nice thin slide that in many ways is... kind of echoes the design of the old Smith & Wesson 3rd Gen, so it feels good inside the waistband, and you know, the compact has a shorter grip, which hides pretty well. You wouldn't necessarily, I think, need some fancy Kydex holster with claws and wedges and stuff to kind of tilt the grip. Like this grip pretty much disappears under anything, just in a basic holster. So it's a good gun for carry from that standpoint, I think. I do carry this one sometimes, and it works well in that rule. Now, your capacity isn't quite as high as I think modern standards, in the compact, up to modern standards. Like, you get a 10-round magazine in this. So, you know, it's a little large for just a 10-round capacity, but if you know from watching my videos, 10 rounds is more than enough for me. 8 rounds is more than enough for me. That doesn't really concern me. And again, if you do get the full size, you get a bit more capacity. So, in conclusion, while it may seem that this is just kind of an obscure gun and kind of a footnote in handgun history, this gun has stood the test of time, and I think it's interesting that it's still being made today. I think that's a testament to the fact that it's just a worthwhile design. It's a good design, and people still like it, and I still like it. It's one of those guns, like I always say, it's the intangibles, the subjective elements in a gun, in how you experience that gun and how it shoots and how it feels and everything like that. That's what makes you really like a gun, and we don't love the guns we love based on their stats on paper, and I think that definitely plays into this gun and why it's still appealing and still something that people keep coming back to. I've enjoyed having this funky K-pop remix on repeat as I've been shooting it and reviewing it, and I will continue to enjoy it, and this is probably a pistol I'll never sell. And if you get a chance to grab one, I definitely recommend it. You know, look online. You can certainly find the full-size DP51s are fairly common. If you look on Humbroker, you'll probably find them, and they're reasonably affordable. Compact ones are a little bit less common, and they command a little bit of a premium. And certainly if you can get your hands on a Lionheart one, those are great too. The first generation LH series were, you know, imported from Korea. They're great. And then starting with the Regulus, they were made domestically. And those are pretty expensive. Even if you find a used one, they're pretty expensive because they're just so rare. But certainly really a good platform as far as handguns, and I hope it continues. I hope Lionheart's able to continue making this platform and making it relevant and compelling, and so far it seems like they are. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. This is Hipster Tactical, and I am Matt.